So to end this lecture, we want to think about how contemporary foodways are actually changing. So think back to the very first video about how foodways changed in India and the impacts on the rest of the culture. So you can see impacts on health and well-being, the environment, the economy, and the culture at large. And that's because all of these aspects are so closely related that we see a change in one that will cause a linked change or a change in another aspect of the culture. Okay, and this is the same thing. We're seeing this all over the world, including here in the U.S. And so we see decreased health in the U.S. as a result of changing relationships with our food, how we make our food, how we consume our food. The only thing is that it's kind of flip-flopped between the wealthy and the poor. So in the Indian example, we're seeing hypertension and high blood pressure and obesity, diabetes in the wealthy populations because they have access to a lot of processed foods. And in the U.S., we see it flip-flopped where we see poor or underserved communities actually having more instances of diabetes and high blood pressure and obesity because they don't have access to healthy foods. Okay, so it's the same process of foodways changing and impacting other aspects of the culture. It's just how they actually impacted the different aspects changed from one culture to another. But we're seeing this all around the world, and what we can actually define this as is changing foodways are undermining food security. And so by food security, we just mean access to sufficient nutrients and foods to sustain an active and healthy lifestyle. And so changing foodways are just undermining this food security because we're relying on processed foods or outside foods instead of relying on ourselves to produce our own food. And of course there are benefits to this, right? Maybe you live in a city and you can't actually produce your own food, so you do have access to food otherwise. So it's not all negative, right? There are some positive benefits to these things, but we have to acknowledge that these linked changes are occurring, and changing one aspect about how we deal with our food can have a wide variety of impact on the rest of the culture. So we want to think about how things are changing. So partly due to global industrialization. So industrial agriculture really affects rural populations. So we're seeing a decline in family farms in the U.S. So our policies are favoring industrial agriculture, okay, instead of small-scale production. And this has a negative impact on a lot of different things, including the environment. So we are requiring a lot of fertilizers, pesticides, and a lot of water to produce food through industrial agriculture. And so this is threatening the environment and causing a lot of damage to our natural environment. And then industrial agriculture is actually relying on non-renewable fossil fuels. Okay? So about 1/5 of all U.S. energy consumption is devoted to industrial agriculture. That is a ton of our energy going to produce food that then is sent and processed and made into other food that is then sold back to the consumer. And clearly this isn't sustainable. Okay, so then we get into issues of public health, okay, which we've kind of hit on a little bit already. But in the U.S. we see overnourishment. So this is where we're having access to a lot of foods that are high in fat, high in carbohydrates, high in processed sugars. And we're seeing an increase in obesity and increase in the overweight population, those being two different levels of overweight. And then we've kind of linked these issues to global nutrition transition. And so this is changing the diet toward energy-dense foods and a decline in physical activity. Okay, so these two things are happening simultaneously, and this is causing an increase in obesity, an increase in overweight people around the world, but specifically in Western countries like the U.S. So really what happened is, we've kind of already mentioned, but we started to get an abundance of really easy to get, cheap food, but that's not super healthy for you. And these are those convenience foods. All right, so low nutritional quality, they're very processed foods. And then we're starting to see economic competition. So small scale farms can't compete with these big farms. Like we said, smaller scale has more vulnerability. Okay, and so it can't compete. So then you've got fewer farms to support this rural livelihood. So you can't survive in this rural nature, so people are starting to move towards cities. City life is then more sedentary. You're obviously not going to be farming a lot of your own food in the city usually, and so you're relying on these convenience foods while you're being more sedentary because you're not out working the land, for example. And so it's just kind of a cyclical process here where we're seeing the same issues over and over again, leading to this overnourishment and a lot of public health consequences. So we also have issues of sustainability. Okay, so people have begun to worry about access to healthy food and the natural environment in general. So two separate issues coming together here. And so then starting to focus on how do we create sustainable agriculture so we can get healthy foods to the majority of people. Okay, so sustainable agriculture is just farming based on integrating the goals of environmental health, economic productivity, and economic quality. Okay, so trying to blend all of those aspects together to create food that isn't terrible for the environment. So part of the issue is that industrial agriculture doesn't necessarily produce better quality or more food. It just seems that way, and it's kind of in our minds that it does produce higher quality food or more food. But researchers have actually found that using agroecology will increase yields by like 90% in some cases, and that is much higher increase than you'll see with industrial agriculture. So agroecology is just incorporating principles of ecology into agricultural production. So going back to rotating crops and finding crops that balance each other out to create very healthy soils and things like that. And so we've talked about how we create foodways, how we understand our food, a little bit of the symbolic nature, focusing largely on modes of subsistence, okay, and then a little bit about how things are changing and how things are causing linked changes throughout the culture, changing in foodways, causing changes in other aspects of the culture. Okay, so last little takeaway is that people are always going to be integrating new foods and practices into their foodways all the time. So foodways are dynamic, just like other aspects of the culture, and whether those changes come from innovation, invention, linked changes in other aspects of the culture, or diffusion from other cultures, changes are happening in our foodways all the time. But for the most part, if a diet works, if it fulfills all of these needs of nutrition, sustenance, and meaning to the people, and some sort of cultural meaning, then people are not likely going to drop everything when a new method comes along or a new food comes along, right? It's more of a slow process of change like we see in most cultural aspects. Okay, and so as we talk about things changing, just always keep in mind that people aren't quite so quick to just drop everything and change to a new subsistence strategy or a new mode of production or a new foodway just because something new is out there. Because these aspects of culture are so integrated with the rest of our culture at large, we aren't changing them like on a dime. It's just the same as the rest of the culture. It's going to change very slowly.